Welcome to our 20th episode in our series, Jesus, Our Sabbath. This has been our theme for the past 19 episodes, and this is the 20th one. And we entitle this episode, The Lord's Day. The Lord's Day. Now, that's a popular phrase used among Sunday keeping Christians who actually are the most in number within Christianity. They say that Sunday is the Lord's Day. But when you ask the question as to on what basis do you ground the Lord's Day on Sunday, there is no biblical text as to when is the Lord's Day in as far as Sunday is concerned. Well, the popular phrase comes from the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 10 and verse 11. Well, verse 10 in particular. This is when John the Revelator, John the Apostle Revelator, was on the Isle of Patmos, and he begins his book. I won't go into how he begins it in as far as the exact wording is concerned, but he speaks about how the revelation he was writing down was from God, from God through Jesus. Jesus gave it to the angel, and the angel would convey it to John. And of course, the entire book of Revelation is a beautiful, beautiful book, a powerful book, which perhaps one day will have an episode or rather a series specifically on the book of Revelation itself in entirety. But it's a book that speaks about the future of the church in relation to the time of John. It also, of course, glimpses back into the past as well, the times of John, but mostly in the main about future events from the time of John the Revelator. I won't go to the various schools of thought. Some are called preterists, those who uh, make the bulk of the book mainly about things that happened in the time of John the Revelator, and very few things being there, those which speak to the future. And then there are futurists who make the bulk of the book about the far extreme end of time, events which mostly are still even future to us even today. And then you get, of course, idealists, those who focus more on the lessons and the teachings, and the things we can learn from the various symbols and revelations given throughout the book. And then, of course, you get those who are few in number, who are called historicists, those who recognize that some events in the book of Revelation deal with the past, in as far as the time of John himself is concerned, from his time, and the book of Revelation gives an outline of history from his time right down through the end of time until the creation of the new earth and the new heavens. And of course, that has a lot to do with historicity of the book of Revelation. But we won't deal with those schools of thought really. They are not necessary for our purposes in this episode. Because in this episode, all we are looking into is verse 10, the phrase where John says, I was in the Spirit, talking about the time when God began to reveal himself as he began to write the book of Revelation. He says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. And I heard behind me a loud voice, as of a trumpet, saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. And what you see, write in a book and send it to the seven churches which are in Asia, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamos, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. Now, we're not concerned really about the prophecy of the book of Revelation, the content and what is in there, what it means. Right now, we're just looking at the phrase, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. And when this event happened, when Christ or God began to reveal himself and asked me to write this book of Revelation to the seven churches. Now, when you ask the question as to when is this Lord's day, there's nothing in the text, nothing in the entire book that says the Lord's day is on Sunday or Saturday. Nowhere in the New Testament is the phrase the Lord's Day described as Sunday. Now, we've already covered a bit of that in our previous episodes when we looked into all the verses in the New Testament that pertain to the first day of the week, and none of them sanctified the day. None of them spoke about the day as being sanctified by God or by Jesus, particularly in replacement of Saturday, which we know in the Old Testament at the very least is when the Sabbath was identified to be. And of course, we then see in the New Testament that the Sabbath, there is no abolishment of the weekly Sabbath. There's no change. There's no amendment to the Ten Commandments. There's no deletion of any of the Ten Commandments, but there's simply silence. And in the presence of silence, the question then is, where does it come from? The idea that the Lord's Day is Sunday. Well, you will find, as we are going to see shortly in this episode, we will just canvass three people who are called theologians, who were called church fathers, those who had high regard among Christianity, within Christianity, after the apostles' time, who were regarded with high esteem as being leaders of the church. Well, not all of them, but those that are relied upon when it comes to this topic. It will just canvass three of them. But before we do that, the point is simply that the interpretation of this phrase is taken from writings outside of the Bible. So, in other words, there is no way within the scriptures, within the Bible, by which the Lord's Day, the phrase the Lord's Day, can be defined in reference to Sunday. In fact, the only text in the New Testament that speaks about the Lord's Day is the one that says the day of the Lord, which is Mark 2, verse 27 and 28. And the day of the Lord in that context pertains to the weekly Sabbath of Saturday. And Jesus says he is the Lord of the Sabbath, and also the Sabbath was made for humanity. So conceptually, the only day that is called of Jesus, belonging to Jesus, being about Jesus, is Saturday, as far as the New Testament is concerned, having regard to Mark 2, 27 and 28. So that is the Lord's Day. There's no other new text, there's no other text in the New Testament that describes or pertains to Sunday being described as the Lord's Day. The only way that those who say the Lord's Day is Sunday, that they are able to say so, is by going outside of the Bible and finding certain authors or Christian leaders of the time, or after the time of the apostles, rather, who would then be the ones who would describe Sunday as the Lord's Day. So that should be very clear that in the Bible it is not there. But keeping in mind what we discussed in the previous episode about the New Testament heresies, that even in the time of the apostles complained a lot about heresy being part or within the Christian church. And Paul himself, we saw in the book of Acts 20, verse later on in that chapter, I've forgotten the specific text, where he complained. I think it's verse 41 or 42, somewhere there, where he complained, and he says to the leaders of the church whom he was leaving at the time, he says that amongst you there will be wolves. There'll be those who are going to speak perverse things and are going to divide the flock, dividing the people of God, and are going to be heretical, basically. So it is not surprising then that you would find during the times of New Testament various thoughts and thought leaders and schisms and divisions within the church. So one cannot safely go outside of the scriptures, outside of the New Testament writings, which were universally accepted as being written by the apostles of Christ, including Paul himself, um, to then go outside of that and look for a particular theologian, no matter how famous he or she was, and then use what they say as a foundation in interpreting what is in the scriptures. Once you do that, then you can come to any conclusion about any topic, about anything that you find in the scriptures, but you need to allow the scriptures to define themselves. If God wanted us to appoint or observe holiness, keep another day holy, other than Saturday, certainly he would have been very clear. Christ himself or through the apostles, where he would have clearly said that the Sunday, the first day of the week, is now the new Sabbath or the new day which should have regard, Christians must have regard for, instead of the seventh day of the Ten Commandments. But definitely the Sabbath day, the weekly Sabbath of the Ten Commandments, the fact that it's part of the Ten Commandments makes it unalterable, because that's the idea behind writing it on stone, to show its unalterability, that it won't be amended, there'll be no change. It is eternal as God is. That's why I don't have 9 commandments now. We still have 10 commandments. And the fourth of those 10 commandments is very clear as to which day it appoints as being holy. So the issue of the Sabbath really it shouldn't be controversial because it's very clear in the scriptures. And the only way to identify Sunday as the day of the Lord is to go outside of the scriptures and find an author, no matter how popular he might have been, who would then, an author or two, or even if it's 20 of them, who would then be describing Sunday in their interpretation as the day of the Lord, which is very unsafe to do, keeping in mind that the scriptures do speak about heresy being there within the church, even during the time of the apostles. How much more after the apostles have died? Now, the question before we go to those three authors, which speak about Sunday in a way that says basically Sunday is the new Sabbath, which I'll come back to shortly. We need to also keep in mind a text that I've referenced or referred to a number of times, Matthew 24, verse 20. I want to make a comment about the interpretation of this text because it says Christ is speaking about the times after his death and the Christian era, basically. He says, and pray that your flight, talk about persecution, your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, not on a Sabbath, on the Sabbath. Obviously, as I've said before, you have no control over winter as to when it comes and how deep it is in terms of the uh, coldness and the temperature and the inconvenience caused by it in times of persecution. Hence, you pray, and that it should not be at that time, which it may still be at that time if God so wills. In the same way, just as there's no power over winter, there's also no power over the Sabbath, in as far as to when the Sabbath arrives. There's no control over it. So you don't pray for something over which you have control. So certainly the Sabbath being referred to is a specific day which we have no control over in as far as to when it is. You don't choose when the Sabbath is. The Sabbath arrives by itself. And of course, in the scriptures, the Sabbath is the seventh day of the week. Now, this is very clear, but then you get some Christians who say, well, this is actually referring to the time of the Jews before the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem. Well, even if that's the case, Jesus is talking to Christians who would have lived for decades before 70 AD when the destruction of the temple did occur. And he's still speaking to them that they don't have power over the Sabbath, which means they don't choose as to when the Sabbath arrives. Besides that, the Sabbath is still being referred to as the Sabbath. It's not referred to as the Sunday or first day of the week. When Christ is speaking to the apostles or his audience in chapter 24, he's talking to people whom, when he says the Sabbath, will understand the Sabbath to be referring to the seventh day of the week. And he says to them that the Sabbath, pray that when persecution comes, doesn't happen on the Sabbath, not on the new Sabbath, which I will give you in due course. No, the Sabbath is very clear. There's no text anywhere in the New Testament identifying the Sabbath with Sunday or the first day of the week. So that should be very clear. But actually, if you look at what the entire chapter is dealing with, it's an answer basically by Jesus to questions asked of him in verse 3 of the chapter. Verse 3 says, now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? Talking about the destruction of the temple um, and um, and then, but then they don't stop there. They say, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So, chapter 24 and 25, those two chapters pertain to two questions. The first question, it pertains to the destruction of the temple. When will that be? Because Christ had intimated that the temple would be destroyed. But then the other part of the question has to do with the second coming of Christ and the end of the age. So the chapters therefore deal with these two incidents or events in an intertwined manner. And they are also parallel because the destruction of the temple becomes a type and example of how also the entire world will become destroyed at the time when Jesus comes in times of judgment. And there are some parallels between the events leading to the destruction of the temple and the events leading to the destruction of the world. but that's not really our concern for this episode. But the point simply I was trying to make was that whether you're dealing with the destruction of the temple or the destruction of the world, those two events happened in the Christian era, and the instruction given by Jesus pertaining to the Sabbath was given to them by Jesus, and they obviously had to observe the Sabbath because it is something that was outside of their control, and Christ expected them to observe the Sabbath. And of course, as one has already dealt with before, it doesn't mean that you cannot run away on the Sabbath, but it's an inconvenience when you are forced to run away, go out and be in the mountains and find safety for your life, when you want to rest, when you want to spend time with your Savior in communion with Him and to fellowship and to worship and to pray. So it is from that perspective of inconvenience that Christ says you then need to pray, should not be in winter or on the Sabbath day. But the point is there is a Sabbath after Jesus. Jesus said so. No different as the fact that there is a winter or there are winters that will be still continue to exist in nature and in law, in the laws of nature, after Jesus would have died and resurrected. Now, friends, um, then we also covered some time back Romans 14, where there's reference to the days that Paul says are not really fixed. He says in verse chapter 14 that some people might want to observe these days on this day, and the others want to observe the other day. And I think it's verse 5 and verse 6, where he deals with one person esteems one day above another or another. But then some will say this pertains, no, 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 you can't be pertaining to the weekly Sabbath because Jesus said you don't have power over it. You don't choose when the Sabbath arrives. The weekly Sabbath remains fixed. The seventh day is still blessed. The seventh day is still sanctified as it was at the beginning of time, during the very first week of creation. That doesn't change. But these days he's talking about in Romans 14 are the annual feasts and the annual Sabbaths, which Paul says is not sinful to observe them in as far as socially and in terms of worship, being present and participating to an extent. There's no problem with that. If you want prefer this day and over the other day, the Sabbath days or the year days, then it is fine. There's no problem with that. But don't use that or don't identify a day and then use that as a judgment on others as if those days are still obligatory. So that's the message that Paul is basically giving in Romans 14. Same idea with Colossians 2, verse 16 and 17, where he talks about the new moons and the festivals and the Sabbath days. Those are days which were in the calendar, which were annual, not the weekly Sabbath. It is separate, the weekly Sabbath. So having then confirmed, rather refreshed our minds on those issues, now let's go to these three church fathers, so to speak, who are highly regarded by many Christians. And let's go to the first one. The first one that we are going to consider is Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius of Antioch. You can just, in this day and age, you don't even have to go to a library in some building somewhere to get information. You can get your information even from Britannica encyclopedias and other encyclopedias and some credible AI software as well, or platforms that they can use. They can point you out to good directions in terms of the information pertaining. But easily through your phone, you can get these quotations, you can get the documents, you can get references on Google to specific libraries and the online platforms where these books have been scanned and put online. So they are very easily accessible. You can just research on Ignatius of Antioch and in his epistle of Ignatius to the Magnesians, which is dated to be around the year 110 AD. By that time, it is believed that the last apostle, John the Revelator, had died, or at least was about to die, if he's not really dead. Keeping in mind that he would have been probably around the age of Jesus or lower than Jesus in terms of age, younger than him. So he'll be very old if you are still alive. But his last book of Revelation, the book of John, those two books are dated very far into the first century. But nevertheless, the Epistle of Ignatius to the Magnesians, dated to be around 110 AD, That's where he speaks about the Sunday as being, of course, the Lord's day. He says, if therefore those who were brought up in the ancient order of things, seemingly pertaining to Jews, I think he's speaking to Jews in the first line, have come to the possession of a new hope, the new hope of the gospel, no longer observing the Sabbath, that is the weekly Sabbath, Saturday, but living in the observance of the Lord's day, Sunday, on which also our life has sprung up again by him and by his death. Now, that's to talk about Christ, the resurrection. And then you move on in reading, and he says later on, how shall we be able to live apart from him? That is Jesus, whose disciples, the gospel, the prophets themselves in the spirit did wait for him as their teacher. And therefore, he whom they rightly waited for, being come, raised them from the dead. Now, that is the first reference that we are referring to, which speaks about Sunday, the first of the week, as the Lord's Day. Now, that's not in dispute, but does that mean it is true just because Ignatius says so in this text? Now, we know in the time of the apostles that there were false teachers, there were false prophets, there were false teachings that were being combated now and again by the apostles, the true apostles of Christ. Now, if that's the case during the time when they were still present, you can imagine what happens after they are gone. The value of this reference, among others, is historical to this in the sense that it is accepted, and I think there's no challenge to accepting it, that there were Christians who had stopped worshiping on Saturday but had now commenced worshiping on Sunday as the day of worship. Whether they regarded the entire day as holy as the Old Testament Sabbath was, or they regarded it just simply as a tradition to say on that day they worship in the morning or during the day in commemoration of Christ's resurrection. Either way, the point is they had stopped worshiping on Saturday, and instead of Saturday, they worshipped on Sunday. Now, there's no problem in accepting that to be a historical fact, that by this time at least, there started to be that trend or practice within Christianity. But then the question is, the more important question is that right to be done? Was there authorization by God, by Christ, for that to be done? Now, for that authorization, you would need to go to the scriptures themselves and not to some historian or some theologian of the time, because you can go to many theologians of the time of after the apostles, and even later on, who say all kinds of things and sometimes contradict each other. So you can't therefore rely safely and build your house on sand. Sand we've been referring to writings outside of the scriptures. In the scriptures, there is no Sunday observance as a day of rest instead of Saturday, or as a day of worship instead of Saturday. But outside the scriptures, you do find that, and Ignatius is one good example. Of course, around that same time, scholars don't agree exactly as to when the next reference was dated or written. The Epistle of Barnabas, the Epistle of Barnabas. There were those who say Barnabas is the same Barnabas who was an associate of the Apostle Paul earlier in his ministry. But it appears that many scholars disagree with that and call this a pseudonym. It's not really him, Barnabas, it's just using his name. Well, either way, the point, that the main thing is that, again, this is a reference written by somebody, even if it was by Barnabas. Why should we assume that Barnabas had not forsaken the faith if it was him? But there's doubt that it was him. Hence, his book is not even part of the New Testament. So I don't want to build my house on a rocky foundation or on a sandy foundation, a foundation that is not stable, that is not solid and reliable and credible, as we have in the Old and New Testament writings. So Barnabas says, now this is dated to be sometime between either 70 AD or between 70 AD and 135 AD, after Jesus would have died, long time after before then. So whenever it was written, the bottom line is that this is not part of the Holy Scriptures. So there was question mark. There was no either there was a question mark or no belief at all that this was written under inspiration. Hence, it was not accepted as part of the New Testament. But anyway, this epistle says, ye see how he says, your present Sabbaths are not acceptable, but that Sabbath which I have made, in which, when having made all things rest, I shall make the beginning of the eighth day. Now you see this theology about the eighth day. Now we know in the scriptures there's no eighth day. There's just one, two, three, four until 7 days, and then the cycle goes back to one. But the theological idea of an eighth day again is linked to the idea of Sunday being a day of renewal, in the way that Jesus was the firstborn of creation, the New Testament says. He's the first fruits. He's the one who opens the way. He's the pathfinder. He's the first of many to follow theologically, in the sense that it is his resurrection that opens the way for our resurrection. So that is true that Christ's resurrection was the beginning, theologically, of a new creation. Even in relation to Moses and Elijah and Enoch before, who had already been translated historically into immortality. But Jesus, their translation into immortality was based on this resurrection of Jesus Christ. So in time and sequence, Christ wasn't the first to be resurrected and into immortality, but it is his resurrection that opens the way for resurrections which had already occurred even before his time. At least the resurrection of into immortality of Moses, as the book of Jude tells us. This epistle of Barnabas then continues to say, the beginning of another word. Oh, therefore, let us also keep the eighth day in joyfulness, in which also our Lord Jesus the Christ arose from the dead. Now, that is Sunday. And when he had made manifest, went up to heaven. So the idea of the eighth day, therefore, is there historically in terms of being the idea that was accepted, espoused, and complied with by many Christians during the at least the second century after the time of the first of the apostles. So exactly as to when the practice started, there is no specific date. It might well have been that even during the times of the apostles, there was an observance of Saturday initially, and then there was also a simultaneous observance, as some historians suggest, of Sunday. Just perhaps be at first merely as a celebration of Christ's resurrection. But then over time, Christians desiring to distance themselves from the Jews, who were their religious enemies and opponents, so to speak, they then began to favor more of Sunday instead of Saturday. So historically, that might be the case, but I don't need to prove that, because all I need to prove is that in the scriptures, it only speaks of one day, and that is Saturday. That is the holy day. That is the blessed day. That's the day Jesus says he is Lord of. Nowhere else in the New Testament you find Jesus referring to Sunday as his day, or a day for us to observe in any strict manner. So the idea of the Lord's Day being Sunday, the idea of the eighth day being a eighth in the sense of a new creation, is there in terms of the theologians of after the times of the apostles, but it doesn't mean that it is true and legitimate in relation to the scriptures. It may be a teaching that many people had, and even if it was the majority of Christians, that doesn't make any difference. The question is not how many Christians or how many theologians or pastors or priests claimed or observed any particular practice, but the question is, what did Jesus and his apostles teach? And the scriptures alone should be the authority. Of course, the last one we'll refer to is that of Justin Martyr. This letter is dated to be around 155 to 157 AD. He says, and on the day called Sunday, all who live in the cities or in the, now he's describing a practice by his time. He says, all who live in the cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the memos of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. Of course, now that speaks to reading of the scriptures and the preaching associated with it. Then, when the reader has ceased, the president, who would be, of course, the presiding person or the preacher, the teacher of the day, verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these things. Now, that speaks to preaching. Then we all rise together and pray. Of course, now these are activities that are associated with public worship. Okay, the first one pertains to the reading of scripture, preaching. There's also, as you read on, I won't read the entire thing. As you read on, it pertains also to the Lord's Supper, the bread and the wine being brought, distribution and offering. That is part of the quotation. I won't read the entire thing. Just perhaps read the second half. But Sunday is the day on which we all hold our common assembly, because it is the first day on which God, having wrought a change in the darkness and matter, made the world. So we should accept then that at the time that this writing was given, we can accept that there were Christians who had this belief. Whether it's majority or minority is neither here nor there, but they were there, who believe that Sunday is the day um, that is associated or should be used as a day of worship by Christians in celebration of the recreation of the world that is still to come, of which Jesus was the first step. And Jesus Christ, our Savior, on the same day rose from the dead, for he was crucified on the day before that Saturday. And on the day after that of certain, or Saturday, now these are different gods, of course, speaking to the planets that we have in the sky, the Roman gods. And on the day after that of certain, which is the day of the sun, Sunday, having appeared to his apostles and disciples, he taught them these things, which we have submitted to you also for our consideration, for your consideration. But then the question comes as to where is that teaching anywhere by any of the apostles? Not Matthew, not Mark, not Luke, not John, not Paul himself, who, although came later, was one of the apostles. So there is no such thing in the scriptures. He might have believed that it was taught that Sunday is the day, but where is the authority? He certainly is not the authority. He was not there. It's what he heard from somewhere, but there is no authority for that teaching in the scriptures. So again, friends, the point here is that the Lord's Day is the Sabbath, is Saturday. That's what Mark 2, 27, 28 says. Nowhere in the New Testament do you find a description of the Lord's Day being any other day but other than Saturday, which is the day that God, Jesus, had established at the very beginning of time, during the first week of creation. So the Lord's Day is Saturday, not Sunday. Nowhere do you find in the scriptures authority for Sunday, unless you go outside of the scriptures, which really you cannot do safely so, because if there was apostasy and heresy in the times of the apostles, how much more after the apostles? So, friends, the Lord's Day is the Sabbath. That is what Jesus taught, that he is Lord of the Sabbath, and also the Sabbath was made for humanity. Saturday is the Lord's Day. May God bless you.